Welcome back to another segment here on GEMS podcast. With me today in the hot seat is a special guest by the name of Mark Schweighofer. And Mark is a lawyer by trade, and we're going to get into some common mistakes that you should be mindful of when you are trying to scale or sell your business. So that looks like buying and selling businesses and preparing your business for sale. But let me tell you a little bit more about Mark's background so you have a full representation of the work that he is currently doing. He provides transactional tax and business advice related to entity formation, partnership and stockholder agreements, equity and debt financing, and business transition. Confident and committed to his clients, Mark takes great pride in gaining a deep understanding of their present and long-term goals, recognizing that no two cases are alike. Mark has a keen ability to adapt and strategize creatively and to communicate complex tax information clearly and concisely. Mark has extensive experience with international tax matters and assists both domestic and foreign clients in structuring their affairs with sensitivity to U.S. income tax considerations. He represents clients before the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, y'all, on complex tax controversy issues in myriad areas, including partnership and corporate income tax examinations, employment taxes, and personal income tax matters. Additionally, Mark works regularly with tax-exempt organizations navigating a morass of complex rules and working to ensure and to maximize the organization's tax-exempt status and protections. So we're going to get into a lot of rules and regulations, what to look out for, and we're going to simplify it for you so it makes sense and it makes it easier for you to digest the material, because I know talking about this stuff could be very mundane and boring, but it's better to be proactive versus reactive if something were to happen to you and your business later on down the line. So would you rather pay X amount of dollars up front to keep yourself out of hot water, or would you want to pay excess amounts later on whenever you are thriving in your business and then you realize that you didn't dot all your I's and cross your T's? So on that note, let's bring on the expert, Mark Schweighofer.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
My pleasure, Mark. So I want to jump into a fun way to get the guests to connect with you. So we could do it via one or two ways. So the first one is an icebreaker, or we could do a rapid fire 10 question game. What are you in the mood for?
Let's do the rapid fire.
Okay, this one's going to be rapid, Mark. Here we go.
All right, there we go.
We're playing rapid fire with Mark and Genesis. Do. Question number one. If you could recreate any significant moment in your life, what would it be and why?
Oh, there's a lot that I'd like to, there's some do-overs you'd love, of course. I don't think I could pick just one. I've had a lot of great moments in my life, but there's, one of the things that I'd like to be able to do, I think, is when the moment's happening, slow myself down a bit and really enjoy it. And so that's one of the areas that I think sometimes, being where your feet are, I guess, is the saying of the day. So that's my answer to that.
So being intentional and just enjoying the moment, you would say?
Yeah, exactly.
Question two, favorite color?
Green.
Question three, what's your drink of choice? Coffee, tea, or something else?
Oh, coffee.
Question four.
I live on coffee.
Question four, what led you to practicing tax law out of all things?
Well, it's sort of by default, I guess. I tried a bunch of different career paths before I decided to go to law school. Even when I went to law school, I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do. I did know that I wanted to be involved in sort of transactional work in the business community, and taxes drive so much of that. And so I ended up taking a tax class in my second year of law school, and I absolutely hated it. But did fairly well at it, and then had a conversation with a professor who said you should, look at this advanced degree called an LLM in taxation. And then from there on, I really kind of fell in love with the discipline after that. So that's kind of how I got here, but it was certainly not by design. You know, I don't think there's a lot of 10-year-olds sitting around saying, I want to be a tax lawyer.
No. Question 5. If you could have any superpower, what would it be?
Well, I was going to say fly, but in the DC, like I think I may change it slightly since I have kids and I live in outside of the Washington DC area. Maybe just teleporting, so you could be different places quickly. Because flying would be fine, but teleporting is just as good, I think.
6. Would you rather a dream car, dream home, or hell, let's go big and have both?
Yeah, I mean, why would you go small? Let's have them both.
7. What is a favorite quote, mantra, or something that keeps you motivated?
I think it was Henry Ford maybe that said, whether you think you can or can't, and I may be butchering a little bit, you're right. So whether you think you can or you can't, you're right. So it just kind of underscores the importance of attitude, I think, and determination on that. And I use that a lot with myself. I use that a lot with my kids when, you know, whether it's coaching or otherwise. It's, you know, that I think it's served me well to this point. So that's been one of my favorites.
8. Being a parent is an incredible job where you're juggling many hats. What's one piece of parental advice that you would give?
I guess, you know, be present, I think, as much as you possibly can be, and listen to your kids. I mean, I think is important too. They're you know, as my children get older, I have an 11-year-old now and an 8-year-old, and they're, you know, watch them turning into real little people, just, you know, looking at them as the future and the way their thoughts, you know, I feel like at this point I'm starting to learn as much from them as they do from me.
Amazing. I like that. 9. No, I'm going to do this question. You get 3 random acts of kindness per day for you to do for someone else. What are your 3 for today?
So I would I would like to donate money to predominantly to some local organizations around here, whether it's combating individuals experiencing homelessness or having some food insecurity. I would like to do some work, you know, some manual labor work with some of my neighbors who are a little bit older in age and can use some help with that. And then really trying to be a mentor to individuals, I think, in whether it's this profession or otherwise, that could just somebody who's just kind of cutting their teeth so they can kind of learn from the mistakes I've made.
Amazing. And question 10, it's our pass or play question, and here are the rules. If you pass, our roles are reversed and you get to ask me a question. If you choose to play, I ask one last question to wrap up rapid fire. So do you want to pass or play?
I will pass,
Okay.
if that's okay.
Yeah,
So looking through and listening to your podcast, since, you know, over the last couple of years, you know, I'm stunned by just how broad a spectrum of guests you have. I mean, you have, and that I think probably has its own challenges in terms of trying to center it for your, you know, for your audience. How do you do that?
so whenever I first started the podcast, I started with me just talking about my grief journey, losing my father in 2020 to medical negligence. So that was the chunk of the podcast. I was just doing solo episodes, and then there were various speakers that kept reaching out to me because I had joined podmatch.com. And I was like, no, I'm not in a space to interview. Then I had an aha moment. I was like, well, I love talking to people. I talked to people a ton when I was in oil and gas via networking or my clients or whatnot. And I was like, if I could do it there, I could do it for myself. And then just backing up before that, there were 3 different CEOs that I was working for simultaneously in the podcasting space that reached out to me to host their platform. So they paid me to interview their guests. And I had no idea like about the work that they were doing, but they appreciated the style that I had and how I could weave conversations and et cetera together. So that also gave me some confidence. And then just fast forwarding, I'm cutting out bits and pieces of the conversation because I know we're on a time commitment. And then whenever I really sat down to let it marinate, I was like, well, I want to come up with pillars. So my pillars around my show is to put out content that's either educational, inspirational, or motivational. And I called it gems because I truly believe that we all have some form of gems to share that someone could learn from, and they could leverage that knowledge and apply it to their particular scope of work. And then since I'm big into DEI and B, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, if you niche down, then that's taking away some form of inclusion. So that's how I kind of kept the broad audience versus how other podcasters choose to niche down. And even though some of my mentors told me to niche, I was like, it actually worked out for me in a competitive advantage because my podcast is ranked in the top 2% globally out of 2.8 million. And I had no idea what I was doing when I was running my own show, because when I worked for CEOs, they had the team of editors, they had all the people. All I was doing was the voice to interview. So I hope that answers your question. We can
No, it
talk.
does. It definitely does, and it's fascinating because, like I said, it's a real skill, and I mean I know your audience appreciates it, but it's definitely it's something that's very hard to do. You know, a lot of podcasts get into the real nitty gritty of things, and it's really hard to be that diverse, and so it's you know I think you pull it off masterfully.
Thank you so much, Mark. And now let's dive into the work that you're doing, because I think the work that you're doing is incredible. And you're actually saving people a ton of money if they're really going to be smart whenever they're thinking about a business. And I could be the first one to say I am guilty, because whenever I started the podcast, I was like, okay, maybe I need to have certain legalities in place. And I was like, I know legal stuff from an oil and gas perspective, but I was like, how can I take the stuff that I learned from oil and gas and partner it with my entrepreneurship journey? Because it is the same, it's just different industries. So let's talk about some of the common mistakes that people make whenever they are transitioning maybe from an employee bucket into entrepreneurship, and they're building their business. And I guess we could say maybe they're bootstrapping their business.
Yeah.
They're working in their business right now instead of on their business. So they're doing everything, and they don't feel like they're at the point where it makes sense to bring in outside people who have a different zone of genius. So let's start there.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's an entirely different seat that you're sitting in when when you go from being an employee, working for somebody else, to being a business owner. Whether it's just you as whether you are the business or whether you have a team of, hundreds or thousands of people eventually, it's just a very different mindset. And it can be very overwhelming, I think, for a lot of people when they're getting started. But the one thing I think that separates that pretty much all successful business owners have is they have that drive and they have that vision of what they want to do. And so they've got the creativity there, and that's one of the things that kind of drew me to the business side of tax and corporate laws, working with those really highly creative people and trying to add some value and some expertise on areas that aren't necessarily, kind of at the forefront for them. I mean, one of the first things I think to think about, as you're starting out is, protecting to some extent what you do have. So if you've worked for a lot of years and you've built up some cash to start your own business, maybe you have a home, you have a family, you have certain assets. One of the things you want to be sure to do is make sure that you have some sort of what we call in the legal profession a limited liability vehicle that would be kind of the face of your business, whether that's an LLC or a corporation. And one of the biggest advantage in my mind of those entities is if you structure it right and you follow all the formalities, having separate bank accounts and books and records. If something happens at your business and God forbid you get sued or something like that happens, whatever the business owns can be at risk, but they're not coming to your house. They're not going to be able to reach your bank account. Your personal assets are secure. So, for somebody just looking to kind of start out, making sure like you have some sort of a limited liability vehicle there, to kind of be the outward facing organization is important, I think, just for that purpose. And then once you've made that decision, then it really becomes, well, there's different types of business entities. Like I said, there's corporations, there are S corporations, there are limited liability companies, and there, and there are different rules that apply to each, and there are different tax treatments that apply to each. And so that's one really where, with the advice of whether it's a lawyer and working with a CPA to kind of help you navigate which one of them is the most, makes the most sense for you. And it may change over time as well, because there are, I have seen a lot of businesses, you can't succeed on day one or day two, but you can fail. And so if you pick the wrong entity from the start, the wrong entity structure, it can be very difficult, not impossible, but it can be very difficult to recover from down the line. And you can end up costing yourself, a significant amount of money on the either on the back end or over time. So I think that's kind of like the key things to kind of think about initially, or to make sure you have, sort of those structures in place and getting the proper advice. Nobody likes to pay for that sort of advice when you're just starting up and trying to, scratch every penny and make the dollars go the furthest. But that is one, having those conversations, it's well worth it. It's worth the investment.
So here's a myth that I want to see. Is it a myth or a fact? Let's bust it. So some people mention whenever they're first starting off, they'll go the LLC route, depending where they're located. That's the most cost effective if they're just getting started, just to protect some of their assets. And then as they begin to scale, maybe they'll transition it to a S corp or a C corp whenever they begin to employ people that are now working for them. Do you think that is a smart and effective route, or do you think that is a myth or a fact?
I think it's, well, not to give the over lawyered answer, but it depends. So the LLC route is definitely kind of the model for the last 10 or 15, 20 years, I think, that most startups use, or most entrepreneurs use as their first step. Whether or not you ever transition to another, into another type of entity, or or different tax classification, really kind of depends on the business. In some instances, like if you're just going to continue to run it forever, and you have a pretty good profit stream, you might want to be an S corporation at some point, just because there are some payroll tax savings that can come along with that under the current laws. But it keeps it relevant, and it's still kind of what we call a pass-through entity, meaning with LLCs and S corps, they don't pay federal income taxes themselves; their owners do, and so there's only a single layer of tax there. So they're very efficient from that perspective. But as you say, as you start to scale, perhaps you're going to go out and be approached by, venture capital or private equity who may, buy the business or invest heavily in the business. They may want it to be, what we call a C corporation, which is a little bit more traditional. It itself pays taxes. And so you may have to convert at some point. So that life cycle that you outlined is pretty much the typical, I think, kind of venture capital or private equity backed model, where you start small and go, start as an LLC and end up as a corporation at some point. Different types of businesses may have, will take different paths on that. So it's certainly not one size fits all, but, in general, I think, what you said is fairly accurate for a lot of businesses.
Perfect. And thank you for confirming that, Mark. And then another question here. Now, since we're in the Great Resignation, we see a lot of people that have pivoted career-wise, and they've had may transition. So they're starting new businesses, and they may not be doing business by themselves. They may be doing it with a partner. And IP, and for those of you listening, intellectual property is king, because it's your creativity, it's your work, and etc. So whenever you enter a partnership, what forms of legality would you say are the go-tos to have in place, like whether it's an NDA, non-disclosure
Yep.
agreement, a non-compete, or ways to make sure that you're protecting yourself as an individual, but your assets are protected, as well as your partner, because even though it's a partnership, you are both bringing something to the table. And if something were to happen where the relationship gets severed, you want to make sure that you're protecting yourself and the content that you're putting out there.
Yep. So you touched on a bunch of really important things there. The first one, I think, is even before you get started and you form a partnership, or we'll use that kind of in the generic sense here. One is make sure that what you're doing is allowed under whatever employment agreement you've had at your prior employer. That I think is a first step. Like, you don't want to be found, you don't want to have a situation where you had a non-compete, or you use some intellectual property that was developed from a former while working at a former employer that they may have a claim to. So make sure. Mhm.
Wait, I want to add something really quick here, y'all,
Sure.
for the audience. So what Mark is talking about is so true, because I would say from oil and gas and energy, whenever I got laid off in the pandemic, I did have to sign a document um, proving that I would not go to a competitor for X amount of time, because it would be a conflict of interest, since the work that I was doing prior was proprietary. So always make sure that you're mindful of what you're reading, and even though there may be loopholes, you never know how a big corporation who has tons of money to hire the best of the best lawyers could always come back, and you don't want it to bite you in the behind. So I just wanted to put that out there, so you're mindful of conflict of interest and competitors, because even though you have information and knowledge, that knowledge could be privy that gives you a competitive advantage over the employer that you just left.
Yep. No, that's huge, and it can derail your business from the start, because a former employer can come in and say, look, that's our intellectual property, right? And we own a piece of that, and it just, even if they don't, it gets expensive and it gets muddled. So dealing with it up front makes a lot of sense. You touched on a really important part. Often there's strength in numbers, right? Or so the saying goes. So you will join forces with other people, and you will form some sort of whether you're both shareholders of a corporation or members of an LLC. One of the key things to have, and it's critical, and it gets overlooked a lot, and frankly, a lot of times it gets downloaded off of, not to disparage LegalZoom or those sorts of those sorts of organizations. They do a lot of good, but you download a sort of a partnership agreement or a stockholders agreement, and it's a very critical document, because it sets forth sort of the rights, duties, and obligations of you and your partner with respect to each other, and with respect to your obligations to the company. So if what happens if somebody dies? What happens if somebody gets disabled? What happens if somebody just wants to leave? The point of these agreements isn't to be super restrictive necessarily, so that, you have to pull it out every time and say, did we do this, this, and this? What that document is there for is to say, when the stuff hits the fan and we're not, we're getting along now, but in the event that we don't in the future, or in the event, I want to go left and you want to go right, how do we settle that dispute? And, other than, my firm does a lot here at Stein Sperling, does a lot of business dispute work, and the overwhelming majority of it is between former partners and former, former business partners. And almost always the dispute was foreseeable at the front. It was just that again, like we talked about before, it's overwhelming when you're trying to figure out how to allocate very scarce amount of resources. But not having that agreement in place, and not having it done, not having thought through those issues, you're only costing yourself a lot more money later. If you're dealing with a very expensive, litigation is not cheap. If you're dealing with a very expensive dispute among co-owners, I mean, it hurts the value of the business. It obviously hurts cash flow. It's very stressful. And it ends up with a lot of bad feelings. And so, if you can deal with that stuff, having it, whether it's if it's an LLC, it's usually called an operating agreement or an LLC agreement. If it's a partnership, it's a partnership agreement. If it's a corporation, it's a shareholders agreement. Those like having that document that kind of dictates, 4 or 5 key points. Like, do we have to put in more money? How do I get out? Am I restricted from doing something if I leave? There's not right answers to any of those questions necessarily, but you need to ask those questions and have thought it through. And then you need to review it every so often too. It's like what worked on day one isn't going to work, 5 years from now, most likely. So you may need to sit back and kind of renegotiate and rethink about that at some point. So I think that's probably of anything for the emerging entrepreneur that's going to have a partner. That's a very key document to have in place.
Amazing. And I know we're approaching our time commitment because we both have back ends. So Mark, I want to throw you an audible to see if there's anything else you want to add. If not, we're going to jump into the call to action. And I want you to plug your call to action, and then we'll plug your contact information. So someone who resonates with this, they can get a hold of you and continue the conversation offline. And once again, I will always welcome you back on to continue the conversation because I know it was condensed, but I just wanted to put enough information out there so they could do their due diligence.
No, I don't think I have much else to add in the limited time, Genesis, but thank you very much and for having me on. I really enjoyed our conversation. On our call to action, I think you hit it in my intro, which is essentially, doing it. Nobody enjoys interacting with lawyers, contrary to what Shakespeare may have said. But in terms of doing things up front, yes, it costs money, and yes, it forces some difficult conversations, particularly among co-owners, as you start out. But it's trying to do, if you can be proactive, you're proactive in a lot of other aspects of your business. Typically, when I look at entrepreneurs, the successful ones don't get there by sitting back and waiting for the world to come to them. Most likely they're out there being proactive, taking risks, taking shots, doing things. The same, you have to do the same thing, to protect the business on a legal front too. As I said before, there's not a lot of things that you can do on day one that will ensure that you will be successful, but there are things you can do on day one that will make that path to success much harder or much easier. And so, I think my message that I would ask people to take away from this is be proactive. Figure out a budget, that you have for legal expenses. Have a conversation with legal counsel about where your budget fits and where that is realistically, and then just make sure. And then kind of sit back and prioritize. These are the things that we have to get done, and this is the thing that if this is the rocket ship that we hope it is, this will protect us both or all of us, however many there are going forward. So I think that's sitting back and being reactive in the legal community typically just doesn't work well. So go out there and you're taking the world by storm, and don't leave this on the back burner.
Amazing. And then the last thing, so you could jump off, I want you to plug your contact information so they could reach you, and I'll also link it in the show notes.
Sure. So I'm at the firm of Stein Sperling, right outside of Washington, D.C. in Rockville, Maryland. My email is my first initial M and my entire last name, which hopefully is in the podcast link somewhere, so people don't have to try and spell Schweighofer, at steinsperling.com. So, and my direct phone number for those who need it is 301-838-3233.
Thank you so much, Mark. So audience, Mark's contact information, once again, will be in the show notes. Don't forget to like, follow, comment, and subscribe. We're on 40+ platforms. You could also see this video on our YouTube channel by going to Gems with Genesis Amaris Kemp. Until the next episode, peace, love, and lots of blessings. Have yourself an amazing day and be an asset, not a liability, and always do your research. Due diligence is key.